Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 113 in the series. It's so nice to see you and to welcome you back to the yarn room. I know it's been a few weeks since I've been able to podcast, and I'm not sure what I should call it. It's been like moving / Swedish death cleaning / absolute chaos. So the studio is full of boxes, and basically our whole house is kind of like we're undergoing this massive like downsizing movement of trying to get rid of stuff. So there's a lot of just things out of place that need to find their own new places. And anyway, it's been so busy that I haven't even sat down to do much stitching until a couple days ago. So yeah, I'm happy to be here to have a few minutes to actually just relax in the yarn room a little bit and talk to you all about what's been going on. And if it looks like I'm being attacked by a massive like blanket monster, I kind of am. This is the worsted weight version of the Persian Dreams throw, and I'm only halfway through pulling it all together, so we'll talk about that on the episode. I also have just finished a new cowl that was designed by Jennifer Chisam of Mountain Legacy Designs, and it's a special Flock Cowl that's going to be up in the Flock Farm Yarn shop just for you all. There are some kits up there in both a DK and a worsted weight version. They'd be perfect for holiday knitting or just because it's getting colder in a lot of places where y'all are watching. So it's a nice cowl, and I'll talk about that finished object as well. Now, when we talk about the blanket, I'm going to talk about some 3-needle bind-off options, and yeah, we'll get to all of that. If you're looking for me other places around the internet, if you're new to the podcast, you can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash. Here, obviously, on YouTube, over on Instagram, Ravelry, and on the blog and website, so knittingthestash.com is where you can find links to everything. That's also where that Flock Farm Yarn shop is. So if you're looking to pick up the yarn that I talk about for the kits, for the cowl kits, that's where you can go to check that out. So yeah, and if you're new to the podcast, it's usually about sweaters. There's usually a lot of garment design and garment modification in here. But because of all the Swedish death cleaning and shop work and a few other things, I actually haven't worked on a sweater for myself in a little while. I've been teaching those classes over on Teachable and doing sweaters for those classes, and other than that I need to cast one on. I feel it's like I did a lot of my sweater knitting over the spring and summer, and I know a lot of you are like, no, wool in my lap in the spring and summer, it would be too much. And it's true, I'm one of those knitters that can just have wool all over me all year long. So I will knit sweaters in the spring and summer, and actually I've been wearing my Reverb Cardigan around finally. I finished that one up this past spring and I couldn't wear it because it was just so warm. But it's lovely. It's a design by Tanis Lavallee, and it has some beautiful cable work on the front and on the back. It has a big cable panel. And I added an extra collar liner to it, so it's got a high collar with a collar liner. It's like perfect for this weather. I've been wearing that with my puffy vest, and it's just great for walks. And anyway, I just need to get some more sweaters on the needles. But this guy is taking me so long. So let me talk to you about the finished object I do have, which isn't this. This isn't finished. I know it looks kind of finished, but it's not. So my finished object is actually this cowl by Jennifer Chisam of Mountain Legacy Designs. And I knit mine up in the Ridgedale Farms yarn, and it's super cozy and really nice and kind of chunky and big. So it's one of these cowls that will fit really nicely under your winter coat, and it will kind of stick up and keep you warm. So I have been wearing mine around under my coat, especially on those cold, windy walks in the morning. It's kind of nice. It'll sit right up in front of your face for those big snowstorms that are going to blow through eventually, right? So one of the coolest things about this, and one of the reasons that I wanted to work with Jennifer on it, is her vision for the little sheep. I thought they were so cute. And you can see you've got some sheep up top and some sheep on the bottom and some cool chevrons in between. But her idea was that some of the sheep could be, you get a couple different patterns, so some of the sheep could be this kind of standard where their little face is right in the middle of their body, and some of the sheep could be this asymmetrical little guy, like this guy, who's kind of looking in a different direction. And the nice thing, as a knitter, you get to choose where you want those sheep. So she has some suggestions for you, and you could knit them all whimsically with their little faces turned, or you could knit them all with their faces in the center of their body. Whatever you want to do with the cowl is exactly right. I knit mine with little black sheep, but she knit hers in a DK weight version with Prairie Shepherd's yarn, and she used a beautiful bluebell background with white natural color for her sheep. So there's just a lot of different options with this. So one of the other things I really love about this cowl is that I think it's pretty modifiable. Go figure, I like modification, right? So it's knit from the bottom up. You start with your ribbing, you work your sheep and your chevrons and your sheep and your ribbing. So you could modify this if you wanted it to be shorter. I could see you kind of cutting out one of the chevron rows, or even collapsing both chevron rows and putting just some stripes in between your sheep. You could also knit it wider or skinnier if you wanted to have something tighter or closer around your neck. I kind of like the width that Jennifer's designed. It's about 12 inches across here, and it's kind of perfect. It fits over your head easily, and it's close enough that it provides warmth and all that kind of good stuff. So I think it's a cool cowl. The color work, let me show you the inside. I think the color work would be suitable for an adventurous beginner, as some people like to say. There's not a lot of floats to catch because the sheep are pretty close together, and there's not a lot of background color or sheep color where you're knitting with any one color for more than 5 or 6 stitches. So you're not catching maybe one float every once in a while, and you can see that on the back you are creating floats, but you're not having to catch them very often. So that's why I would say an adventurous beginner. If you're willing or interested in trying some color work, this would be a great project, especially because the sheep repeat themselves and the chevrons are a kind of easy to memorize pattern that repeats, and because, like I said, there's not a lot of blank space in between the color changes, so you're not having to capture too many of those floats, which makes it easier for beginners, right? So let me talk a little bit about the yarn that I used for this project. This version that I knit up is in the Ridgedale Farms yarn, and it's perfect because this is the Flock Cowl for the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, and it's using farm yarn to create little sheep out of sheep, which is wonderful. So this is the color combination I used for mine. This is the Ridgedale Farm yarn. It's a worsted weight yarn, and this particular blend of the yarn is 150 yards for every 4 ounces. So in the kits you get a full skein of your background color, your main color, and a half skein of your contrast color. And in this case we have a beautiful black, I guess it's a very dark, rich brown. I would call it a black. I think Angela Cartwright of Ridgedale Farms would call it a black. But you put those two together and you have some really nice contrast. And Ridgedale Farms raises Rambouillet and Columbia sheep. So what I've done in the kits is put together yarns that are the same grist, basically. So all their yarn comes from their different sheep. So this particular yarn is from a sheep named Horse, and that's why it's this color, because it's just all of Horse's fleece. So what I've done is put together the same grist. So this yarn is about 150 yards for every 4 ounces, and this particular black is also 150 yards for every 4 ounces. So this kit, they really work well together. The other version of the kit that I've put together uses the really dark brown / black yarn for the background color and the lighter taupey beige for the contrast color. And in this case, this yarn is still a worsted weight, but it's 184 yards for every 4 ounces, and I think this one is 190 yards for every 4 ounces, so it's a nice pairing. They go well together, and they'll knit up well, they'll play well together in the cowl, I think. So those are 2 options for that kit, but there's a third option, and this is the option that Jennifer knit up, the designer. I sent her some yarn to play with, and she chose the Prairie Shepherd's yarn. And the Prairie Shepherd's yarn is a blend of Leicester Longwool and Corriedale and Cormo. So it has, you can see this kind of has this fuzzy halo about it. And it's got some of the properties of a Longwool in terms of luster, but it has good memory because it has the Corriedale mixed in there and the Cormo. So it's a beautiful yarn to use. And Jennifer said it held up really well with all of her revisions to the pattern. So she would knit and rip it back out and knit again. And this yarn, she said, held up really well. So I was glad to hear that review of the yarn. So in her version that you'll see up on the website, she uses Bluebell for the background color and the White Natural for the sheep. And what I've done is put together kits with so you'll get a full skein of the background color that you choose and a half a skein of the natural white. And I've got a bunch of choices, but they're kind of limited. So if you're interested in getting one of these cowls, I would encourage you to go over and shop early. These are the other main colors. We have This is Rutabaga Brown. She's a beautiful, I'll show it up against the white because I think that'll give you a sense. We're getting blowing it out a little bit with the cameras. So this is the Rutabaga Brown with the white. This is the Prairie Duck. I love the Prairie Duck with the white. You've already seen the Bluebell. This is Bergamot, which is a beautiful purple with the white. And I have something similar to that, somewhere between Bergamot and Blueberry. This is Dew, so it's a little more subtle as a background color. And finally, Jack in the Pulpit. And all of these yarns from the Prairie Shepherds, this is a fun collaboration between Kathy Capel and Christy Pyatt over in Sydney and Monticello, Illinois, and they raise all the sheep, the Cormo and the Corriedale, and then they did all the hand dyeing. So this yarn is really special because it's a special collaboration. There's only so much of it, and we're getting down to the last few in the shop. And that's what I used to put together the kits for this particular DK weight version of the cowl. So if you're interested, the kits are up in the shop in both the worsted weight version with the Ridgedale Farms or in the DK weight version with the Prairie Shepherds yarn. And I think it makes for a really fun, wintry kind of accessory knit, quick to knit up. I think I knit mine up in granted it was the worsted weight version, but I think I knit it in maybe 2 nights, maybe 3 nights if I wasn't absolutely engaged with it one of those nights. It's a pretty quick knit and very fun and very cozy, and I like how the Ridgedale yarn fluffs up and has a lot of texture to it. And as I said, you know, I love the Prairie Shepherd's yarn because of its luster, and it's just beautiful. So that's my finished object for the week, the Flock Cowl. You can get your kits over in the shop if you're interested. The pattern from Jennifer will be released independently of the kits in about a month, so if you want to learn more about her designs or follow up with the Flock Cowl later on just to get that pattern and use some yarn from your stash, that'll be in December. And you can follow Jennifer around at Mountain Legacy Designs on Instagram, and she has a Ravelry Designers page as well where she's putting up her new designs as she goes. She's coming up with some really cool patterns, so I hope you'll follow her around on the internets. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to clear my lap a little bit here so that we can talk about the Persian Dreams Blanket. This is the worsted weight version from Janice Hope, and I've been talking about this for I can't even remember how long on this podcast, because it is one of those blankets that I started when I didn't know much about color work, but I really wanted to knit it, and I didn't want to do the fingering weight version because I had kind of heard that it would take forever, and I was really happy there was worsted weight. Anyway, long story. So for those of you who have been following along in this saga, you'll know that I opted for an option that other knitters decided to go for, which is to use a Chroma, Knit Picks Chroma yarn for the color work. So Chroma is a yarn that is kind of a, what would you call it, a gradient or an ombre yarn or something like that, where, you know, over time it changes colors by itself. So it kind of mimics the work that Janice Hope was doing in her pattern with the multiple colors for each of these squares. And then as other knitters have done, I've used just a basic black as the background, which makes it end up looking like stained glass. Right? And as I said, this is only about halfway done, scarily enough. And you can see that there's the other issue is trying to tag each hexagon to try to make sure that you know which one is which. So as I laid it out on the bed to kind of get a look at it, I posted a pic up on Instagram, and you guys were also kind and said wonderful things about the blanket, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much. But something that a lot of you said was that it did look like stained glass, and I couldn't agree more. Because I think that these chroma schemes that really give you this changing color just provide a beautiful centerpiece for each of these hexagons, and I love them. But the tricky part is, how do you keep track? And when I laid them out, I decided, you know, I had some that had a lot of yellow in them, such as this one, and some that had a lot of purples and blues and kind of darker colors in them. And I wanted to space them out on the blanket so that I didn't end up with like all the yellows over here and all the purples over here. So you can see that I've pinned not only the number of the design, but also the yarn that I used, because I used multiple different colors of chroma, as have other project makers of this blanket. So I used things like Ferris wheel, confetti, sugar cookie, and I can't remember, carnival. I think there were a few other ones. Anyway, they're all interspersed. And so you knit all these different charts with different colors of chroma so that you end up with this kind of wild mix of different designs and different colors. So when you lay it out, you kind of have to swap in and out, like number 1 knit in confetti versus number 1 knit in carnival, you know, you need to reverse them or whatever it is. So I laid that all out and I tagged them this way. This seems to have worked. It's just a little safety pin stitch marker with a doubled over post-it note, basically, with the information written on it. So that keeps me honest. And then the other question was how to do the borders and how to join the hexagons. So of course, I went back to Ravelry and all the different project pages to get a sense of what other knitters have done. And in the pattern, you're told to basically leave the edges of your hexagons live. So these are all on waste yarn. These are all live stitches all the way around. And you're supposed to Kitchener them together. And Kitchenering is a grafting technique where it looks seamless because you're basically creating a row of knitting in between one hexagon and the next so that it looks absolutely seamless. Well, I wasn't interested in that because Kitchenering, I'm fine with Kitchenering. It's not that difficult of a technique, especially after you do it a while. I've knit enough socks to be comfortable with it. But I wanted this blanket to have a little bit more structure, and so I knew that a seam in between each of the hexagons was going to give it a little more structure and a little less stretch if I were to toss it around. Or my son likes to, when he was little, he would drag the blankets around the house. So I just imagined them getting a lot of use, and I think to myself, okay, we need some structure. So I did decide to go with a 3-needle bind-off instead of the Kitchener stitch. Now, here's the interesting part. So when I talked about that on the last episode, Assia Brill, who's the brilliant mind behind Distitch Knitting, she and I have had an email correspondence for a while, and she wrote to me and said, hey, you know, 3-needle bind-offs can be, there are different ways to do them, and some of them you might be happier with than others. So she sent me tons of different videos, tons of different links, so helpful. Thank you, Assia, for taking the time to send all that information my way. And I followed up by looking at a bunch of other websites. Purl Soho has one up, Willy Wormhead has one up, and everybody's talking about this 3-needle bind-off and how to basically change it so that instead of this ridge, and we'll see if the camera can pick it up, instead of this ridge that you get, I think you can see that a little bit maybe, you get this ridge where you have a purl row of stitches sitting on top of your knit rows. Because you're knitting 2 together, I do it on, back side. So I have my good sides, my right sides smushed together, and then I'm working my 3-needle bind-off on the wrong side of the work. And you end up with this purl ridge sitting on top of your 2 other stitches. So because you're knitting 2 together, that's just how it works out. But thanks to Assia and a number of other videos and makers out there, I was curious to just see what the difference was between this bind-off and the modified 3-needle bind-off. So the modified 3-needle bind-off, you basically knit the first stitch and purl the second stitch, and you have to do a little bit of maneuvering with your yarn. If you're familiar with the 3-needle bind-off, you can do this other modified bind-off. But you maneuver your yarn around so that you knit that first stitch, purl the second stitch, the stitch that's behind, and it ends up creating a little bit of a flatter join or a flatter seam. So I tried it out on a couple of these hexagons just to see. I was very curious, and I didn't see too much of a difference in the case of this blanket, in part because I knew my seams were going to be on the wrong side of the work. I knew they were going to be in black, so can't really make that out too well, especially not on a camera. And even if you're sitting there with the blanket, I mean, I guess you could feel it a little bit. But because I was able to get all that information and follow along with Assia's comments, I found out that sometimes these modified 3-needle bind-offs are perfect for certain situations. So if you were, for example, going to do a 3-needle bind-off on the right side of a work, right? So you put your 2 wrong sides together, and then you wanted to bind off on the right side of your work, and you wanted to have a seam that laid flatter and didn't create that pucker, and also didn't create this, gully here, because that's because I've done it on the wrong side. If you wanted to have something kind of flat laying on top of your work on a right side, maybe up on a shoulder, maybe along a side seam, decoratively speaking, something like that, then this modified 3-needle bind-off would be perfect because it creates a really beautiful, almost like a braid looking seam along the place where you're trying to join the two pieces together. And it's laying relatively flat. If you look at it, you'll see that there's a kind of knit stitch sitting on top of the work instead of a purl stitch. And that just makes the whole thing lay a little bit flatter and more decoratively. It's more decoratively or aesthetically appealing, I suppose. So I would encourage you to check out those links. I'll put them down in the comments here or in the notes for the show so that you can go and check out a few of them. And again, thanks to Assia for passing along that really cool information and giving me something else to learn. I really appreciate that. So I decided, like I said, to go with the regular old 3-needle bind-off, even after all of that. And I think it's holding up really well. I like the way that it's working out for this particular blanket. And I worked these 2 squares up just to be able to, or squares, hexagons, just to be able to show you how that seaming looks. Now the other thing I decided to do was to add more, it's usually called white space, but in this case it's black space, or negative space, or border space between the hexagons. So in the original pattern, you're supposed to take your hexagon, which ends up looking a lot like this, with the color work going right to the edge, and you're supposed to take this one row of background color and Kitchener it to another row of background color on another hexagon. So you would end up with very little difference or distinction between this one, this pattern, and the next one. They just kind of like would mush together a little bit. I didn't really want that to happen with the blanket because I wanted each of these hexagon designs to be distinct and to have some kind of border or framing around them. And this is something I talk about in my Teachables classes. Like when you're going for adding a different design element, say, to a pattern, one of the things you want to pay attention to is white space or negative space or borders, because they can really highlight the thing itself if you're careful enough to add, you know, something around the thing that you want to highlight, because everything else falls to the background and the main thing kind of comes to the foreground. So what I did with each of my hexagons, as you can see, and I saw this on some of the other project pages, how people had done this, you add some more of the background color around, and I ended up doing 4 additional rounds for each of the hexagons, and yes, that meant taking each of these hexagons, which were on waste yarn, and putting them back on the needles and adding 4 more rounds of the black background color. And I worked an increase round, straight round, increase round, straight round. So 4 extra rounds with 2 increase rounds, and I work the increases the same as you would for the, you know, following along in the regular pattern where you work your increases for the regular hexagons, do the same thing with your background color as you go. And you end up with a nice bit of this background around each of the hexagons, and then when you join it to the next hexagon, which also has a little bit of that background, you get a nice stripe of black that really helps to distinguish each of them from the other, and I like that very much. The other thing I've been doing, as you can see, it's a kind of slow, tedious process, in part because I'm just using 2 sets of needles, and so I have to keep taking them in and out as I join, but I'm using the waste yarn, and instead of putting waste yarn around the entire hexagon, which I was doing at the beginning, you can see this is all in one piece of waste yarn. Now I'm putting waste yarn on each of the edges. So there's one piece of waste yarn here, another piece of waste yarn here, same all the way around. And that way when I go to join this next group to whatever's already knit up, I can really select this side with, you know, whichever side it is that I'm working on. Say it's this guy down here. And all you have to do is pop this on the needles and pop this side on the needles, and suddenly your 3-needle bind-off is super easy because it's just those, I think it's 36 stitches or something like that. So it makes the joining so much easier if you take the time to put each of your sides on a little piece of waste yarn. I know it sounds a little bit persnickety or something, but I do think that it does help with the final version when you're seaming everything up and you're trying to make sure that the right side gets joined to the right side. It's much easier if your separate sides can be seen a little bit easier because of that waste yarn, the single piece of waste yarn. Now I did have a moment, maybe that's what precipitated this a little bit, where I joined, I think it was a number 7, I'm not going to be able to find it here now, but basically I joined one of these in such a way that it was kind of crooked. So like this seam ended up over here and this seam ended up over here, so I had like a fold in the blanket unintentionally. Yeah, that's not exactly what you're going for. So I think this method of putting each side on a piece of waste yarn has been a kind of saving grace for me in putting this blanket together. Now, as I said, I guess I'm 2/3 of the way through. I have 2 more columns to go, and this is the next of the columns, and basically I'm joining them in order. So this is, it'll be 7, 6, 6, 1, 7 or something like that. Anyway, I'll join the next one, so I have this long string of them, and then I take the whole blanket and join the column to the blanket. It's gonna be a while, and as it goes, it's kind of growing in my lap, which is keeping me warm, but it's also a little bit complicated to keep track of. So hopefully by the next episode I can talk to you about the final ultimate border that I'm putting on the whole thing. I've made some choices there and modified some things, and yeah, hopefully by the next episode I'll have the finished blanket for you to look at, and it won't be a blanket monster sitting next to me in the middle of the studio. So I think that's about it for today. If you're interested in getting one of those Flock Cowl kits, head on over to the Flock Farm Yarn Shop at knittingthestash.com and get your hands on a DK weight version or a worsted weight version. They make great gifts too. Oh, and there are gift cards in the shop too. I know we're coming up on holiday seasons and some things are harder to get than others if they're stuck in shipping containers. Hint, hint. But I do have gift cards finally up in the shop too if you're interested in that kind of thing. Those are over there as well. It was really nice to take some time away from the chaos of the Swedish death cleaning that we've been doing and spend some time with you guys. I hope everybody's well, and I will see you in a couple of weeks with even more fun surprises for the holiday season and for the Flock Farm Yarn Shop, and yeah, maybe even a finished massive blanket. So I'll see you in a couple weeks. Take good care. Bye-bye.